leaves the Dutch, and the Dutch don't have the leverage that is necessary to force the rest of the EU to pick up a topic, much less run with it.
Do you think that the Biden administration seriously intends to keep these barriers up, or is it just a matter of had gotten around to taking them down?
No, they've been codified. Like I said, Trump and Biden, from an economic point of view, are very similar. They're both economic nationalists. This is the new normal for American policy.
I wonder. I
said, people who believe my way, we're lost.
Well, I'm not seeing that this so far is catastrophic for Europe. I mean, it's only touching certain industries. The winter hasn't come yet, and Europe still can do plenty of trading with other European countries. I don't think they're that dependent on these industries in the United States, on the U.S. market, maybe.
The vulnerability is there, but you're right that at the moment the center is holding.
Mm-hmm. How about the energy situation? I was intrigued by the suggestion that Norway could somehow manage to get enough oil out to prop up the UK. Do you see that's possible?
The UK, yes. Europe, no. They did find a few new fields over the last few years that are proceeding apace. The problem is the time to target. These projects take years to bring online, and the ones from 5 years ago now are starting to produce. So you can get incremental increases, and if you double investment, which is probably what we're going to be seeing over the next 5 years, you can see that those flows continue and even enlarge. But that's nowhere near enough to replace what we're going to be losing from the Russian space. And remember, in energy, we've seen a 2/3 drop off in global investment into petroleum and natural gas production. That takes years to manifest. We're seeing the early stages of that in Europe now. If we flip the switch on new investment today, we will not feel that in any meaningful way within 3 years, probably closer to 8. So the drop off that we've seen in global supplies from the Ukraine war, this is just the very beginning of a decade transition.
What would the US have to do to replace the missing fossil fuels in Europe?
The United States, the primary issue for Europe is not going to be oil, it's going to be gas. Now, the United States is in a glutted natural gas system historically because of the shale revolution, but we've increased our demand for natural gas by half over the last 15 years to absorb it all. That's one of the reasons why natural gas prices are higher in the United States than they've been for a long time. If you start talking about sending another 15, 20 BCM of natural gas to Europe, which is the scale that we would need to do to make a difference, that would almost unify European and American natural gas prices, and that is not on the table. Just the build out of the infrastructure in order to avoid that sort of price increase in the United States, which would be completely politically unsustainable, is not something we can do in less than a decade.
I'm not sure I fully understand why it would send prices skyrocketing like that. I mean, fungible commodity.
Natural gas, anytime you've got an inelastic commodity market like natural gas, where, if you get 90% of it, 10% of you is screwed and you have to decide what to shut down. You take pricing from the marginal supplier and the marginal demand point. And in the case of Europe, they've lost one of their baseline suppliers in the Russians, and they're replacing it with all marginal suppliers. So any individual one of these marginal suppliers now is setting the price, and that's why you're seeing natural gas prices that are 5 to 10 times what they were just in January. In the United States, our baseline material supplier was so huge, it was waste gas coming out of the shale fields, that we traditionally, for the last 15, has it been 15? Since 2007? Yeah, 15 years. We've had natural gas in the $2 to $4 range, when in Europe it's been in the $5 to $10 range. You guys are now dealing with 70. We are now dealing with 9. Because we are becoming a marginal supplier to the European market. For us to become a baseline supplier just takes more than we have without a massive price exposure or a massive infrastructure build out that you don't do in 2 or 3 years.
So basically the way it's working now is we are practicing a form of gas autarky.
A bit, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I've been wondering why we haven't been trying to compensate for that to hold the alliance together, but it sounds as if there's really good economic reasons not to.
Yeah, you can't replace this big of a supplier in a short period of time unless you are willing to consider other forms of fuels at large scale. So really the solution, if that's the right phrase here, is at least a 2 to 3 year build out of coal and nuclear across the entire continent.
Well, the solution is nuclear. The solution to all of it is nuclear.
Well, nuclear is great for electricity, but natural gas is not just for electricity. It's also an industrial input. It is the base of the entire German economic model.
Right, petroleum, chemicals.
Unless you can find a way to bring it in at low cost, and I don't see how that's even physically possible, much less theoretically. I'm sorry, I don't see how it's theoretically possible, much less physically. We are talking about the end of the German economic model over the next 12 months. That will have its own series of consequences.
Yeah, downstream everywhere in Europe. In the United States, one thing that you don't really spend much time dwelling on, perhaps because it's just too depressing, is the United States political dysfunction. And I'm wondering to what extent it looks to you so politically dysfunctional as to some ways, make your prediction about the United States less rosy. Can we think about a political hyperpower, political and economic hyperpower without a functional government?
Sure. So in many ways, culturally, the United States is very well adapted to change, and that keeps our economic transitions constantly adjusting. So we don't usually have these big shakeouts like you will have in Europe. But politics, we do the opposite way. We don't have party lists. You don't vote for a party in the United States. You vote for a specific candidate who is running in a specific district to represent a specific set of constituents, and they need one more vote than whoever comes in second. That means our parties are relatively weak, but the individuals within our parties are relatively strong. And that manifests as a series of factions within each individual party. And those factions rise and fall based on shifts in demographics and technology and economic exposure. Okay. Which means that every once in a while, the factions don't just rise and fall within the party, they jump ship, or new factions rise or factions die. In the last 30 years, we have had the rise of globalization and the fall of globalization, the rise of China, now the falling of China, the rise of the baby boomers, now the retirement of the baby boomers, the information revolution, social media. It makes sense that the factions are going to be moving around a lot right now. Every time that happens, America looks like it's about to fall apart. But all it is politics reshuffling into a new form that's more stable and appropriate for the age that we're actually in. This is the 7th time that we have done this. I have no doubt that we will get through it. But damn, it is an awkward experience. And if you look back to the times that we've done this before, say the 1920s, the fall of the Whigs, or the rise of the Democratic Republicans, it always looks like it's the end because it is the end of the party system. But then a new party system comes out. So I'm not to the point yet where I feel confident enough to predict what the new party structure is going to look like. At the moment, the Democrats are in a state of disintegration, and the Republicans have shed their national security voters, their business voters, their fiscal voters, and it's just a cultural conservative core. It's big, it's significant, but it's not particularly stable. So we may get a third party briefly, but one of the three will then die within a couple presidential cycles. This is the 7th time we've done it. It usually takes 7 to 12 years. We are now in year 6. So we know we have at least one more presidential cycle to suffer through before we get to whatever's next. In that time, it's difficult for the United States to focus on anything else, especially abroad. So the fact that the Biden administration has been able to do anything coherent in foreign affairs, particularly of the scale of what's necessary for the Ukraine war, again, has my respect.
Certainly doesn't seem as if anyone is thinking coherently about the border with Mexico or our immigration policy, which I agree with you. I think that is the most important issue, and the one in which Americans seem least capable of thinking it through in a sensible way. Where do you think that's going? Do you think there's going to be a point where we can talk about this in a reasonable way?
We'll get there, but this is an issue that has inflamed Americans independent of the political system for quite some time. But I actually am hopeful that this time is different. Now, why? Donald Trump. Now, I'm not a fan. There are a lot of things that I think he did that were just atrocious, and I think he, as an ex-president, is not a particularly good human being. However, one of his seminal achievements, not just economically, strategically, or as president, but for American culture, was the renegotiation of the NAFTA Accords and the redefinition within the American political right of the role that Mexicans play in the United States. What most people forget in the United States and abroad is that Mexicans are social conservatives, and they are rapidly moving over to Trump's interpretation of the Republican Party, which means that in the American right, Mexicans are now part of the family. And that change in identity is hard to do, but Trump made it happen. So when people are looking at the border now, there is a recognition in the United States that Mexico is not part of the problem here, that these are Central Americans and they're not part of the family. And, that's its own issue and its own problems. But when you have the group in the United States that has been the most opposed to migration suddenly thinking of Mexicans as normal people, that's a big step forward culturally. And that's where we are now.
I see what you mean. All right. Now, final words on political forecasting in general. How well can you do it, and what do you need to know to be able to do it?
Political forecasting is hard, and so, excuse me. I try not to do very much of it. I do geopolitics. I deal with issues where the baseline materials and the baseline information hasn't changed in decades and sometimes centuries, sometimes millennia. And so there's a pattern to follow. And you know that infrastructure is going to be easier to build in flat areas than mountains. You know that water transport is going to be more efficient than land transport. And you basically build a map. And then you look at other maps. And you use that to kind of suss out what has to happen. The hard part of geopolitical forecasting is figuring out when it is going to happen. So the rise of the United States, easy. Disintegration of the European Union, easy. Is it going to happen this year? Hard. That is one of the advantages of books, is that they are a repository and it doesn't all have to happen next Tuesday.
Disintegration of the European Union. Why do you think it's inevitable?
Well, let's start with the demographic situation. Every country in Europe has aged past the point of demographic reconstitution, with a few exceptions. France is at the top of that list. Second, because of that, the EU has kind of devolved into an export union. So it is now dependent upon the ability of, almost to a Chinese degree, of getting raw materials in and getting the physical exports out. And then third, because of the way the Americans ran globalization, we actually did encourage the European continent, to the most part, to give up security as one of its guiding lights, because in the past that had led to a series of wars that ultimately we had to come in and settle. And so when I say that the Europeans have not really stepped up to the plate for Ukraine, I don't necessarily mean that as a condemnation. In many ways, that's a feature, not a bug, of the way the Americans designed the post-Cold War order. But that means that the Americans have to remain engaged day to day in order to keep the European system going in its current form, strategically and in terms of economics. And I don't think that's a good bet moving forward.
Peter, you're sickening before my eyes. I can see it. Your eyes are getting glassier and redder. I think I'll let you go rest. I keep talking.
I've got to be on stage here in about an hour and a half, so that's going to have to wait a little bit. But it's nothing that cough syrup and coffee can't fix.
Yeah, I think you need an antihistamine. I think you're visibly sickening, and I don't want to be responsible for killing you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
No problem. It's been a pleasure.
Fascinating.